Welcome to the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute's Zoom forum. We've had forums for 20 years, 25 years, but we've been Zooming only during the virus epidemic. Perhaps it will continue thereafter. Today's theme is the Eurasian Economic Union, a very important development, a weighty development in the region, and it will be the subject of a paper which the Institute will issue by the end of the month, so I urge you to pay attention to that. Also, I want to announce now and repeat at the end that between June 16 and 19, mark your calendars, there will be a 4-day conference, a Zoom conference that be sponsored jointly by the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and the Rumsfeld Foundation in connection with the Mamuka Forum, which was supposed to have been held in Almaty in June on those same dates, but it obviously had to be canceled on site. So we're doing it virtually. So we'll send out more information on the Mamuka Forum. Mamuka, as you know, refers to Central Asia, Mongolia, Caucasus, and Afghanistan. So turning to the Eurasian Economic Union, we have two very highly qualified speakers. We're going to lead off with Mamuka Tsereteli, who's in charge of programs at the Institute. Mamuka is an economist who's followed this particular issue very closely, both in its north-south and east-west dimensions. Then we're going to hear from Stephen Blank, our old friend who's been a student a close student of Russian affairs for a generation, and whose judgments are always grounded on massive research and to be taken seriously. So let us lead off with Dr. Tsereteli, and we'll go directly from that to Stephen Blank.
Thank you, Fred. We'll share screen, and you will see some few slides of our presentation. But let me start with a kind of like a basic history of the Eurasian Economic Union. Obviously, a lot of people know about that, but probably a little reminder will be helpful. Organization started with the idea shared by first president of Kazakhstan, Mr. Nazarbayev, in 1994, during his visit to Moscow at his presentation in Lomonosov University. And for almost 2 decades after that, while this idea was floating around, and while customs union started some operations in the mid-2000s, there was no real progress in development of this union. But by 2014, countries arrived to the decision to actually formalize this relationship and take it to the next level of integration. And I think obviously the geopolitical factors played some role in the process, but not only. There were some economic reasons, and our friend Steve will talk about some of the geopolitical elements that were impacting formation and then development of the union. If you could have slides, please, posted. I think probably we should mention from the beginning that this is a union of about 183 million, population of 183 million people. 5 countries are members now. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And the economy of those 5 countries are, as you can see, about $2 trillion output. And but if you look carefully, it's obvious that Russia is dominant economy in this union, and the trade between countries is obviously dominated by trade between Russia and other members, and it's almost 97% according to data from 2018. and only 3.1% of the trade between members is taking place outside of Russian Federation, which shows obviously the reality of this picture of this union. Next slide, please. Internal trends in this, I think it's important to mention that starting from 2000, year 2000, trade between countries was evolving and growing, but in terms of percentage of trade between Russia and other members and other members themselves outside of Russia hasn't changed much, and that's demonstrated by some graphs that we are going to show a little later. In fact, only Armenia's share of trade is increasing within EU. Other members' trade within EU is not changing much, and that's also kind of interesting detail. In fact, in some cases, it's actually declining, and even in case of Belarus, which is more integrated in European Economic Union than other countries, it is declining. Also, I should probably mention here that we use abbreviation of Eurasian Economic Union as EEU, although official site is used UAEU, so that there's no confusion here. Next slide, please. This presentation also, I should probably mention that is based on some of the data we've collected from some of our fellows from Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and we'll have them presented in our report that will be published in end of June. I think it's also important to mention that this trade between these countries are following overall trends of economic development and overall trend of GDP growth and so forth. It's interesting that most of the countries peaked in 2013 or 2014 in terms of their economic output, then had sharp decline because of the lower energy prices, also sanctions imposed on Russia after annexation of Crimea. And that had a drastic impact on GDP performance of countries. All of those countries that we are going to discuss today, and we are focusing on 3 countries in South Caucasus and Central Asia today. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia are our target of analysis today. And if you look at numbers of GDP and their trends, I mean, in terms of evolution of their GDP growth, you'll see that this peak arrived in 2013, 2014, but then it went down, and after 2016, GDP was growing again. But obviously, this pandemic that is spread around the region and also globally will have a significant impact on the performance of countries. Expected GDP decline in Kazakhstan is 2.5%, in Kyrgyzstan 4%, in Armenia 1.5%. But obviously, these numbers are subject to reevaluation in probably 2-3 months, because nobody really can know exactly how where the world economy will go, when and if commodity prices will recover, and so forth. Next slide, please. So I think we'll start with some of the slides here that demonstrate trade turnovers of countries of interest: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia, as I mentioned. And you can see from this graph here that performance, trade performance of Kazakhstan, it follows, in a sense, GDP development, overall economic development, but share of trade with Eurasian Economic Union is not changing much. If you look at from 2005 and 2000 to 2019, you see this trend is pretty much follows ups and downs of economic performance of the country. Next slide, please. So top 5 destinations for Kazakhstan's export are In 2009, there was Italy, China, Russia, France, and Switzerland. And now we have almost the same, top 3 countries are the same. And so why Italy? People who watch Kazakhstan closely know that it's because of energy exports. And the import, if you look at import data, Russia remains the top trade partner, but scale of China's role in import of Kazakhstan is growing. But overall, trend remains the same. So export destinations are more diversified than sources of import in case of Kazakhstan, but also in case of other countries. Next slide, please. I think it's important to mention when Union was created, countries were hoping, obviously, other than Russia, were hoping that this will benefit their economies, both on trade side, but also flow of investments and economic development. I think these slides demonstrate that flow of FDI from Eurasian Economic Union in case of Kazakhstan is really very, very minor. And so in terms of, and foreign direct investments are major sources for for not just economic growth, but also employment and technological advancement. And if FDI's sources of FDI will always define priorities of countries in terms of their foreign economic relationships. So this slide indicates that Eurasian Economic Union is not playing any significant role in the economy of Kazakhstan. For it's only 1.1% in 2019, 2018, 1.6%, and so forth. Next slide, please. In case of Armenia, you see that share of trade with the Eurasian Economic Union is relatively higher in economies, about 30% in 2019. But also, while there is an increase, if you take it base number in 2010, there is some increase, but it's not that significant. In case of Armenia, as I said earlier, this is the probably highest growth in among all the other countries, members of the Eurasian Economic Union. So Armenia trades more with Russia after joining, but it also trades more with other members of the Union. And we'll say a few words later why it's the case. Next, please. So top trade partners of Armenia are shown here. Both on export and import, Russia is a dominant trade partner for Armenia. In terms of export, it's some other countries, Switzerland, Bulgaria, Iraq, Germany, and in sources of import, those are China, Iran, in addition to Russia. Next slide, please. In terms of Kyrgyzstan, you see that again, since joining, the share of trade with the Eurasian Economic Union in total trade of Kyrgyzstan is stagnant, not much changes. It goes a little bit up, but then goes down. And again, this shows that role of Eurasian Economic Union in trade for this country is not the decisive factor. I mean, it's important share, if you look at the share but it's not changing much since the membership. And if in fact you can see that before joining, because of economic circumstances and outputs were slightly different, it was higher before the membership than it is now in terms of, again, share of the trade with the Eurasian Economic Union versus share with other countries, trade with other countries. Next slide, please. In case of Kyrgyzstan, you see that obviously UK is #1 export destination because of some of the mineral export that goes to UK, where Russia is second. But in case of import sources as well, China is now ahead of Russia in terms of being the sources of import. And so it's changing. The dynamics is changing. In case of other countries, Russia used to be the dominant sources of import or export destination in the past, but it's no longer the case. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I don't want to spend much time on. Maybe we'll just go very briefly through this. That remittances are playing very significant role in economies of some of the countries like Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and so forth. But every time there is a decline in Russian economy, as we all know, there is a decline in flow of funds from Russia to other countries. So this fluctuation of economic performance in Russia affects countries and GDP of countries, because remittances play a very significant role in GDP of Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and other countries. So now I'm sure Steve will address some of the most recent developments in terms of what may happen with this regard going forward because of the economic situation inside of Russia, economic decline of Russia itself, and so forth. But I think we shouldn't expect there will be any significant return back to the scale of remittances that we had in the past. Next slide, please. I think it's important to mention that organizationally there were some things happening during since formation of the union that allowed some improvements in terms of getting work permits, let's say in Russia for other migrants from other countries, labor migrants, getting driver licenses or recognized driver licenses from different countries, and recognition of mutual recognition of some diplomas, not all of them, but some diplomas. So that was helpful for some countries. But as we discussed already, it didn't affect much all the countries. I mean, Armenia was a probably exception again. Next slide, please. So I think we'll probably stop here, and we can have more in-depth discussion during the question and answer session. Fred, back to you.
Thank you very much. Stephen Blank.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Mamuka. The Eurasian Economic Union is also a political animal as well as an economic institution. And it is part of a larger Russian or Putinite vision of where Russia plays in regard to the former members of the Soviet Union, not only in Central Asia, but also Armenia and Belarus. And Moscow would dearly love to include the other members of the former Soviet Union, Azerbaijan. Georgia is gone, of course, as are the Baltic states, but also Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, who have refrained from joining. This political vision is essentially to create an economic institution, as Putin has said, modeled after the European Union, that would be part of Russia's sphere of influence and would allow Russia institutional and economic levers to remain the primary actor in Eurasia. And this is also clearly part of the broader Eurasian vision now that seems to dominate a lot of the rhetoric concerning Russian foreign policy. Second, it is also an attempt to prevent the European Union and China from each encroaching economically on this sphere of influence, because everyone recognizes that to the degree that there's economic hegemony or dominance, such as what Russia has in regard to Armenia, political influence and dominance follows as well. So to the degree that China is the most important foreign economic player in Central Asia, and has been for about a decade, without an institution like this, Russia would be eclipsed in Central Asia. Likewise, in the Caucasus and in Belarus, and before 2014, as Moscow hoped, it wanted to prevent the European Union from dominating Ukraine. Indeed, that's why it went to war in Ukraine in 2014. So this is an attempt to restrain both China and the European Union from having too much influence on what was former Soviet territory. But it is also an attempt to create an institutional mass, if you like, that would be facilitating Russia's ability to play in this greater Lisbon to Vladivostok vision that the Russians had at this time. And without that institutional sphere, they would also be eclipsed by the US, European Union, and China. Beyond that, the Eurasian Economic Union has become the centerpiece of Putin's vision for Russia's role in the Eurasian area since he returned to the presidency in 2012. And it therefore is very much a key Russian foreign policy project. But it has not worked out necessarily according to this vision. As Mamuka's slides show, China's economic influence continues to rise. And with the Belt and Road Initiative, it is growing even faster than it was a decade ago. Even if we assume that the Belt and Road Initiative has lots of problems, that many of the projects are not well conceived, and so on, it is nonetheless putting an enormous amount of Chinese investment into Central Asia and the Caucasus and Belarus. It is allowing those governments to turn to China as opposed to Russia when Russian pressure becomes too great. And for all the Russian talk about a greater Eurasia with China, the fact of the matter is that this is going to largely be a unilateral Chinese process where Russia picks the crumbs off the table rather than he's a co-equal partner. I can give people an example. It was a big deal for Russia to talk about what they called a high-speed railway from Moscow to China, to Shanghai, I think. It was supposed to go through Moscow, the Volga, Siberia, parts of Central Asia to Siberia, and then to China. It was to be financed by China and built by Russia. It is now being financed by China, and it completely bypasses Siberia, which means that China essentially owns the railway. And if you look at all the other projects, including Arctic ones, for example, where China is supposed to be putting billions of dollars or billion of yuan or rubles, as the case may be, into these projects, they are basically for China's benefit, not for Russia's. Likewise, Central Asian trade with the European Union has continued to grow. Furthermore, the Eurasian Economic Union does not resemble the European Union. When Russia's economy sinks, everybody sinks with it. In the European Union, despite enormous problems which are always being reported, when economies get into trouble at the end of the day and after a lot of pulling and hauling, European Union has bailed them out. And indeed, the European Union has just now taken a major step forward in the Macron-Merkel initiative, which, if you follow it, is a major step forward towards genuine economic integration in Europe. Nothing like that has happened in the Eurasian Union. As a matter of fact, when the COVID virus crisis began, Moscow was busy essentially undermining its economic partners, acting without any regard for their interests whatsoever. Moscow's energy war with Saudi Arabia was carried out without any regard for Kazakhstan, whose energy exports are a major part of its economy, or Uzbekistan, and they suffered as a result. When the coronavirus hit in mid-March, Moscow closed its borders to Central Asian migrants. That may have been sound epidemiology, but it was bad economics as far as these people were concerned. And there were no compensatory gestures. Moscow also dispatched a plane full of supplies to the US without consulting or notifying its partners. Only sometime later did it open up what Putin now calls a green corridor to Central Asia. So in other words, Moscow does not act as if it has partnership responsibilities. It acts, not surprisingly, as a great power, thinking strictly about its self-interest and, if necessary, throwing its partners under the bus without any compensation. As a result, Moscow's newest proposals, which were unveiled 10 days ago at the meeting of the Eurasian Economic Union, went nowhere. Belarus, and particularly Kazakhstan, as well as Kyrgyzstan, opposed these integration proceedings. Moscow, here again, had to retreat, just as it had to retreat in the oil wars and is suffering much more from coronavirus than it will let on, and in foreign policies as well. So what this shows is that the Eurasian Union, for all the fanfare about the greater Eurasia projects with China and the attempt to model an institution after the European Union, is failing to achieve its strategic purposes for Moscow. Furthermore, there is reason to believe that the levers that Moscow has in its possession, energy transport, remittances from migrants, wheat exports to Europe, to Central Asia rather, are not playing as effective a role as Moscow wants them to play. They certainly have an impact, and we would be remiss if we denied that impact, but they are by no means creating an integrated economic bloc under Russian auspices. If anybody seems to be benefiting, it is China. And furthermore, we see signs of regional economic cooperation in Central Asia, led by Tashkent and Nur-Sultan, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, that gives signs that the Central Asians are looking to find and developing their own individual path towards regional or sub-regional integration, and that the Eurasian Union may not be as viable an instrument for a mutual benefit or for Russia's predominant benefit as the originators first hoped 6 years ago. So let's take some questions. You're on mute, Fred. Fred, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. I would like to lead off with a question of my own, but before doing so, those in the audience who have questions should use the chat feature, and we'll look forward to receiving them. My question is this, to both of you, very quick response. Yes, we understand the strongly political character of this, geopolitical character of this project. On the other hand, what the green corridor that was announced just a couple of days ago, what about it? Isn't this doing exactly what we heard it was created to do?
Well, that's the intention. It remains to be seen how it actually works out in practice. As you said, it was just announced on Wednesday, or Tuesday rather. And it may not be enough, frankly, to overcome the bad decisions that were made earlier this year by Moscow as far as its Central Asian partners are concerned. So it could turn out to be something significant, but it also suggests that Moscow was forced into this by means of the resistance of its partners to further integration proposals coming from Russia. So,
is it temporary or permanent?
I don't know, and I think it's far, it's only 48 hours old, so it's far too early to give any judgment.
Mamuka?
Zones. Now it's becoming popular all around the world to look at those kind of green corridors. It has to be designed properly. It has to be then special protocols needs to be developed in order to implement them. So I don't think that this is probably more political statement than something already designed or defined. So I'm sure going forward with economic performance of Russia, they will need people coming back once recovery starts, but it's not going to happen anytime soon, in my opinion. At least there will be at least months, if not a year, before that development will occur. So I think it's more a political statement at this stage than something practical, although some movements probably will start.
Thank you. Let me ask you this, both of you. One can conceive different scenarios for the future. One variant would surely be that the Eurasian Economic Union makes slow but steady progress after a long and rather retarded start, it nonetheless begins a slow uptick and over time gains momentum. Second variant would be stagnation, more or less the present level, plus or minus a little bit, a few variations. And the third variant would be decline and collapse. Now, which of the, if you're betting, and obviously you don't have a crystal ball, you can't predict the future, but if you were betting, which of the three would you put your money on?
In my case, stagnation. And because of the preponderance of Russia in this system, as long as there is stagnation in Russia, that is, that the economic reforms that Russia needs don't take place, it will act as a drag on all the other members' economies. Now, of course, each of the other states, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, are going to make their own economic decisions, but they are also going to be influenced very much by what happens in Russia. And I do not see Putin making the necessary economic reforms here or elsewhere that are necessary to really galvanize the Russian economy. What's more, the wager on energy, I think, has run its productive course. Energy prices may go up slightly from the crash that we saw a few weeks ago. They're back up to about $33, $35. But Russia has had to accept major energy cuts in production. And the long-term trend is away from hydrocarbons towards renewables. Furthermore, we see this stagnation throughout the Russian economy. You can look at the Arctic, for example, where Putin has conceived of these enormous mega projects where billions of trillions of rubles are supposed to be spent. And after 12 years of already spending a fortune on the Arctic, we have exactly one oil pipeline and one gas pipeline to show for this. And the money's not there to bring about these projects. I think the long term, that is, let's say 3 to 5 years, forecast for the Eurasian Economic Union is one of stagnation. And the longer that stagnation lasts, the third option of collapse then becomes possible.
Thank you. Dr. Tsereteli.
I would agree with everything Steve just said. I would just add that if you look at these countries individually, other members of the Union other than Russia. So Belarus is already on its way of diversification of trade from Russia to other countries. Same is happening with Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, more or less. And as long as problems exist in Russian economy, as long as the benefits of this union is not translated into something tangible for these countries, they will look for other alternatives. And they are looking at alternatives in the region, obviously, first of all, in neighborhood. With Uzbekistan opening now and the trade and the regional trade growing in the region, obviously, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan will be looking more at immediate neighborhood for both markets as well as sources of import. So I think this will be a natural process that will happening and that will stagnate this relationship inside of the union. Armenia, because of geopolitical reasons, has not much alternatives. That is why Armenia's attachment to the union is growing. It's not overwhelming, but it's growing slowly. So I think that individual cases of each country demonstrates that overall the stagnation will be probably most expected scenario going forward.
Both of you presume that your conclusion in favor of likelihood of stagnation, it assumes that the alternatives to Eurasian Economic Union are not there. That they are sufficient, however modest individually they may be, they are nonetheless sufficient to counterbalance anything that the EEU would offer, and therefore enable them to continue as they are, more or less, and hence the stagnation thesis. My question is this: are you so sure that the alternatives, that the individually or collectively are up to the tasks that you two are assigning them. And by alternatives, I don't mean just internal. I'm speaking about India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe and America.
If I can start, and then maybe Steve will follow. I mean, if you look at Belarus, clearly Belarus trades now more with its neighboring countries in European Union, Ukraine, and others in Baltic states than it used to do. So I think there is an alternative. Belarus, with this location, has definitely great access to European markets and other neighboring countries, and Belarus could become a beneficiary of the greater integration in the Black Sea, Baltic state, Adriatic development. So that's, I think, significant alternative that is forming around Belarus. Going into Central Asia, you see clearly growing interest coming from subcontinent, India, Pakistan, other countries. I see greater interest coming from Japan and South Korea, much greater than it used to be towards Central Asia. If you follow statements and some publications in the media from Japan and South Korea focused on Central Asia, you see much greater interest now. So alternatives, I think, are there and options are there. And most importantly, I think with the untapped potential of intra-regional trade inside of Central Asia, Afghanistan included, that opens, I think, new opportunities for all the states in the region, not just members of the Eurasian Economic Union, but others as well. So I think it's always been the case, what Russia offers to these countries and what are the alternatives offering to these countries. I mean, we had this interesting case in the past 20 years ago, 25 years ago, how Russia itself, by not developing its own infrastructure system, pipelines and so forth, and by these systems being dominated by monopolies of Gazprom and Transneft, actually forced other producer countries to look at alternatives. If Russia were to be open country for trade, and I don't know if you looked at just recent reporting about how Russia prevents shipment of Kazakh coal to Ukraine and established actually quotas for shipment of coal from Kazakhstan to Ukraine. Even established quotas are not allowed to be shipped after all. So Kazakh producers of coal are suffering. They are losing market because of Russia creates barriers for trade between Kazakhstan and third countries. So looking at this reality, why Kazakhstan would be kind of confident in the future of this union. And that is why President Tokayev actually, if you had the chance to look at discussion at Eurasian Economic Union during last summit, Zoom summit, by the way, the dynamics was very interesting. When he was speaking, reactions of President Putin, obviously he was not happy, and you could see it from the body language. I mean, I think that reality of interest growing from other sides and alternatives offered and options that Russia provides to these members being limited, I think defines the future of this partnership.
Do we have any solid survey data from member countries and non-member countries, for that matter, as to how the public views this project?
I'm not familiar with the recent studies. Steve may.
No, I'm not aware of any reliable survey evidence on this question. It might exist, but I don't know about it.
It's an interesting challenge and one that could easily be met. Maybe some of our fellows might take that up.
I think there is this so-called Central Asia barometer that does measures public opinion, and there are some surveys. You can see some discontent with the growing China presence in Central Asia. I've seen polls about that, but and some countries see this union as a sort of balancing factor in the past, but I think as time passes, less and less they see this as a balancing factor for China's economic.
And Russia's own approach to the implementation of its greater Eurasia project actually prevents Central Asians from viewing Russia as somehow a balance to China.
Well, absolutely. And furthermore, it not only prevents Central Asians from seeing that, it impedes Eurasian economic development, because we have a virtual cottage industry in Russia of foreign policy and economic analysis talking about the greater Eurasia and the projects and so on and so forth. But as the old television commercial in the US said, where's the beef? When you look at what's actually being built, it's all Chinese. For example, we've seen, and you know about this very well, there's been a lot of talk for years in Russia about a north-south project to connect Russia through the Volga and the Caspian and Iran and Central Asia to India. But there's nothing there. Iran is now beginning once again to try and reconnect with Central Asian and Caucasus countries, not always in the smartest way. But although the Indians would like very much for something like this to happen because it would be very equivalent of a BRI, Russia can't build it. It's not happening. And I'm not as optimistic about the future of Afghanistan as others are. The Taliban appear to be gradually prevailing there, and they're not going to be interested in supporting large-scale foreign infrastructural investment. That's the last thing in their worldview that interests them. So we may still have some real problems. But even though Central Asia would be negatively affected by that particular development, India and Southeast Asia are clearly an interest. Mamuka was right about Japan and South Korea. We see interest in the Middle East, Gulf states, Israel. There may be others. And the United States is now becoming more interested in economic cooperation with Central Asia also. If you read the administration.
Neither of you has mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Does this have any relevance to our discussion about the role of the Eurasian Economic Union in Central Asia?
I've never seen a direct connection in published materials. Well, what goes on behind closed doors, obviously we can't know. I think the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is a meeting place where Central Asian heads of state can talk to the Chinese as to what they want and need and vice versa. But I don't think that this SCO is going to provide an economic institution that's going to be involved with tariffs and trade and so on. It is not intended for, or I think ever going to be, an analog for the European Union in Europe. I think it's
it was said that the SCO doesn't do security, but in fact, SCO has done some security-related activity in the region.
Well, it does security, but it doesn't do international trade and investment, at least not formally, and not in its published.
So let me put this to Dr. Tsereteli: is there any alternative? You might find that this is not going anywhere, that it's unbalanced in Russia, overwhelmingly unbalanced in Russia's favor, and all that. Yet, what's the alternative?
I mean, you cannot change your geography, obviously. Russia will be there for these countries as a big neighbor, and they will trade with Russia. They will have exchange of those migration processes going on back and forth, and including labor migration and remittances moving. You know, any large state is a provider of the public goods for its neighbors, whether they want it or not. That's a reality of life there. But I think you know this issue better than probably anybody else in the world, that these countries for 30 years, their priority was always their sovereignty. They wanted to maintain their statehood and survive all these pressures coming from different, mostly from Russia, but from other actors as well, to somehow reduce their sovereignty or make them less sort of their voice to be heard in more limited manner. I think a statement of President of Kazakhstan on that summit was demonstration of that we are country here and we are presidents, and I am the president of the country, and I have my own opinion about strategy that you designed in Moscow. So I think that's a very essential factor that we need to take into consideration. Sovereignty is a priority for these countries, and whatever impacts that priority, they will react. So economic relationships and economic ties are very essential for them, but I think this is the priority.
Okay, here's the big one. We've been looking into the future, globe spinning, but the future has really been a future that is more of the present. I would like to ask you both how the Eurasian Economic Union looks in a post-Putin world. That might not be immediate, it might be a generation from now, who knows? On the other hand, it is a finite arrangement that exists in Russia today. Let us suppose, more specifically, that there is evolution either under Mr. Putin or after Mr. Putin in the direction of a less, if you will, paranoid and aggressive foreign policy toward one that is driven more systematically by market-based economic considerations. Suppose it goes in that direction. What does that do for the Eurasian Economic Union? Good or bad?
Well, let me take this one first, Fred. Since you and I both come out of the historical school in Russia, and you've written about the great reforms, I see Putin, the post-Putin regime, is in the following way. I think that whoever succeeds Putin, and it's almost certainly going to be a man, not a woman, is going to first have to build a coalition of peers to get to the top. Because if he has to rule through a coalition, very little will be achieved. I think this individual will have to realize, if he doesn't realize it already, that fundamental reform is necessary. And that brings us to the situation such as that of Alexander II or Gorbachev, that the dilemma, what I call the dilemma, or maybe you did, the dilemma of the reforming czar. He's going to have to launch major reforms inside Russia and in foreign policy. And they're going to have to take the pressure of the state off the economic motor vehicle and let that motor go forward on a more market-oriented trajectory than has been the case.
Good or bad for the central, for the...
Well, let me go on, because this will lead to an upheaval in Russia, I think. It always does. I think it will force the Central Asians to take a quantum leap forward and accelerate what we already see as the beginning of regional cooperation. If it's successful in Russia, then the Eurasian Economic Union might become a better vehicle for economic cooperation with Central Asia, and for that matter, with Armenia and Belarus.
Thank you. We're very little time on turning to Dr. Tsereteli.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's. I agree with most of what Steve said. I think if you can imagine Russia as a reformed state with the open economy, which allows its infrastructure to be used by other countries, whether it's transit or so forth. If it allows movement of people much easier than it does today, if it allows investments freely from other countries and so forth, clearly stronger Russia, more reformed Russia, economically prosperous Russia will attract attention of its neighbors more than it does today. Whether it's possible or not to do it in a short period of time after President Putin is gone, I agree with Steve. It's a history of Russia shows that I mean, European-style rule in Russia, at least so far, didn't work well. So we know good attempts of reforms, but those were done by force mostly. So that's probably where we'll be.
Thank you. This is very interesting concluding remarks. First, I'd like to thank both Drs. Blank and Tsereteli for their very interesting observations and concrete information on a subject that needs a lot more concrete information. You have pointed, among other things, to the need to see what public opinion in the region of Central Asia has to say about this project. Maybe that will become the focus of future study. Maybe our fellows in the region will take that up. I want to remind everyone that on the 16th to the 19th of June this year, our annual CACI forum will be taking place virtually. The keynote speaker on the 16th will be the former head of the World Bank, Robert Zoellick. Very interesting aggregation of speakers from the region and from the world, and discussions and comments and debates and so on. So plan to spend some time on those 4 days, 16th to the 19th of June on the CACI forum. We will also have other Zoom forums which will be announced through our usual channels. We hope you'll share news of this with all your friends and relatives if they're shut into their homes or if they're out having a good time. This is Fred Starr. I want to thank you all for attending and look forward to meeting with you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.